Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're just going to wait for a minute or two while people start to populate the Zoom webinar room. We'll get started in just a moment. Great. Well, hello and welcome to today's event. Should big tech pay for the news they use? Policy interventions to rebalance the relationship. My name is Daniel O'Malley. I'm the Senior Digital Governance Specialist here at CIMA. And it's really my honor today to be moderating this all-star panel that we have prepared for you. I just want to take a moment to set the scene a little bit about what our discussion is going to be today. And what is the role, or what should be the role, of big tech in helping to sustain independent journalism and news media markets globally. According to the 2022 Reuters Institute Digital News report, big platforms are now the main gateway for access to news online. So, both social media and search combined account for more than 50% of referrals to news outlets in the digital space. And it's also, as more people go online, and as this trend continues, so does the ad spend. The ad spend moves online. And actually next year, social media is going to surpass television ad spend overall. And so this space is becoming increasingly dominated by big tech, and the digital ad space itself is controlled by a small group, a duopoly of Facebook, Meta, and Google. And so in some markets, this duopoly accounts for 80% of the digital ad market. So what this essentially means, what this trend is that we see happening globally, is that whereas originally money that went directly to media outlets for advertising that then could be used to support journalism is now being passed through a different intermediary, big tech. And for big tech, journalism is often an afterthought, as it's not necessarily a central component of their business model. And so this is what's kind of happening globally and has shifted our media markets. And we've seen policymakers in the US and the EU and in Australia, the bargaining code, the Journalism Competitive and Preservation Act in the US, the Digital Services Act, and the Copyright Directive in the EU as being policy ideas about how to rebalance this relationship. But what is happening in other markets around the world, and how will this impact news outlets in some of the other places that outside of the global north? So this was the topic of a recent CIMA report written by Dr. Courtney Ratch, Making Big Tech Pay for the News They Use. And we're going to get to hear more from Courtney in just a moment. But before we get the conversation started, I want to make sure that I introduce all of our esteemed panelists. So first, Dr. Courtney Ratch is a journalist, scholar, and free expression advocate who writes and speaks about the nexus of technology, media, and policy, and provides expertise in strategic consulting to mission-driven organizations. Currently, Courtney is a fellow at the University of California, Los Angeles' Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy, and a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation and the Center for Media, Data, and Society. So welcome, Courtney. Wayu Diamitka is the Chief Executive Officer of Info Media Digital, the arm of Tempo Media Group. In 2016, Wayu led the Indonesian team of the Panama Papers Project. He is a member of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, ICIJ, and Wayu is also a board member of the Alliance of Independent Journalists and Secretary General of the Indonesia Cyber Media Association, AMSI. Then also, so thank you for joining us, Wayu. We have Patricia Campos Melo. She is currently the editor-at-large at Folha de São Paulo newspaper in Brazil. She is an associate research scholar at Columbia University, working on a project on electoral disinformation ahead of the Brazilian 2022 presidential election, which is going to happen in just a couple weeks. For over 25 years, she has been covering international relations, economics, and human rights, and has reported from over 50 countries. She has been awarded numerous prizes for her international reporting and research, and including, this is a really good one, the Order of National Merit by the French President Emmanuel Macron. So congratulations and thank you for joining us. And last but not least, Prue Clark, who is the founder and executive director of New Narratives, a nonprofit organization building investigative journalism and news businesses in the global South. Prue is an international journalist whose reporting and commentary has done place in more than 20 countries for outlets like the Washington Post, the Guardian, the Financial Times, Foreign Policy, and the BBC. Prue also created and led BBC Media Action's radio and social media programming in affected countries during the 2014 Ebola crisis. And she was also the director of international reporting at the Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York. So thank you for joining us, Prue, and thank you all for joining us. So how today's event is going to run is I'm going to lead a kind of moderated panel discussion for about the first 40 minutes. We have a lot to get into, and I've asked all the panelists to also engage with each other when possible. And we also really want to hear from you, our audience online. So we've reserved approximately the last 20 minutes for question and answer. We're going to be using the Q&A feature of Zoom. So if at any point you have a question that you want to ask, please populate that into the Q&A feature, and we'll make sure to get to that. So without further ado, I want to start with you, Courtney, because you've recently published this report, Making Big Tech Pay for the News They Use. And I'm really curious to hear, one, what are some of your main findings, but also what were some of the things that maybe surprised you as you were doing this research about how these policy interventions are playing out in places beyond the global North?
Thanks so much, Dan. And thanks for helping support this research. I think what I did is a global survey of both what policies have been implemented and what different countries are looking at. And so we're really seeing three types of policy interventions. One is taxation, so mainly taxing the ad tech infrastructure and then redistributing that to journalism. There's another one that is focused on intellectual property. And so that is about creating the opportunity for news organizations to enjoy copyright over their news snippets and images and et cetera, and things that are used by news aggregators and platforms. And then there's the third policy intervention, which is around antitrust. And that's focused on giving news media bargaining rights, the right to collectively bargain to news media groups so that they can try to at least be a bigger fly as compared to, the giant tech behemoths that we're talking about, the $1 trillion companies. These policy interventions, I think it was really interesting to see how they are depending upon each other. So it's really hard to draw fine lines or clear lines between them. On the other hand, when you're legislating, you have to start somewhere. So what we're seeing is that in Australia, they took the approach of antitrust, and so giving news media collective bargaining rights. You mentioned the Journalist Conservation and Preservation Act here in the US, which is looking at doing the same thing. There's also in many of these proposals an interest in algorithmic transparency and providing some heads up to news organizations when major changes in algorithmic policies are going to impact news media visibility. Obviously, the pivot to video on Facebook that turned out to be based on false evidence was a huge money suck for journalist organizations that reoriented around that. What surprised me is how we are making these policies in essentially a data vacuum. There is very little actual information and evidence about the link between traffic and revenue. There are a couple of empirical academic studies that were done shortly after Spain and Germany adopted similar laws as the EU copyright directive before there was a European-wide directive. But those were very limited in terms of time, in terms of scale, in terms of what they could actually see. And then the News Media Alliance did another study. They're a lobby group for the news industry in the United States, and it showed, a different sort of impact. So the fact is, it's a giant black box. Even PricewaterhouseCoopers did a report and couldn't account for about a third, if I'm remembering correctly, of the advertising revenue that was floating around in the ad tech infrastructure. So the big takeaway that really surprised me is the first thing that we need legislators to do is to require transparency and access to data, particularly for researchers. So there are several policies being proposed around the world that would propose researcher access to data held by the platforms. We also need media organizations to do a better job of collecting data. And I'd like to see the creation of a data collective so that we can learn more for our industry. Not surprising, we're seeing in Indonesia, in South Africa, in India, in Canada, in the US, really all around the world, there is this desire to do something to help the journalism industry. And while we, haven't really gotten into the should or not, I think there's kind of widespread agreement that at least some of these things probably won't hurt. They might help. And so at least let's give it a shot.
Great. Thank you, Courtney. That's really interesting. I think that the issue of data and what do we know is definitely a big gap. I want to turn now to Wayu, because one of the big policy interventions that's gotten a lot of attention in the past couple of years is the Australian News Media Bargaining Act. And in Indonesia, I believe that organized media collectives, actually even before that happened, were already thinking about and working towards kind of collectively figuring out if you could engage with platforms on some level. And so I know that you've been thinking of that as one of the strategies. So I was wondering if you could just kind of give us an update on where that is right now and what the challenges you've seen in terms of trying to collectively organize media organizations.
Sure. In Indonesia, the initiative is led by our press council. So it's an independent state institution that represent publishers and also journalists. Most of the mainstream media are part and have representative in the press council. We learn a lot from the practice in Australia. I think we also receive very good advice from our counterpart in Australia, and but I think the big focus for the policy initiative in Indonesia is how can we together preserve and protect quality journalism, because the ecosystem, the media ecosystem right now is heading towards a landscape that don't really incentivize good quality journalism. So that is the main focus of the policy draft. And now the draft is already in the government hands. It's already submitted by the press council after, I think, more than a year of deliberation with all of the stakeholders in the media. And we hope to see, I think in the near future, it will become a government regulation issued by the presidential office or the Ministry of Information and Communication.
Great. And also, if you could talk a little bit about, obviously getting to this point, there was like some reaction about what the current situation is that led to this kind of desire. I was wondering if you could just give us a little bit more context about kind of the current state of the Indonesian media market and why media outlets have decided to pull this together and push in this way.
Sure. I represent one of the association, the Indonesian Cyber Media Association. We have 400 media outlets as our members all over the country, but 75% of our members are local media. So these are small outlets, 10 to 25 in the newsroom, and they really depend on government budget, so local government budget. And this is not something that is sustainable for the future of the media. But they don't have any other option because the current advertising, online advertising market is not really favorable. They don't really give incentive for news media outlets. If you want to get a big pie in the online advertising market, you need to really go for the content that create the most traffic, and sometimes it's not really news. So we really need to do something about this ecosystem, and I think the platforms, the big tech, also have responsibility. They also have a responsibility to contribute to a better media ecosystem, because that in the end we want this is for the benefit and the interest for all in the country.
Great, thank you. No, it's really interesting to hear about what's going on in Indonesia, and we're going to be following up with that for sure. I'm sure it's good to know that the government now has the draft. Patricia, I want to come to you now. We've heard a little bit about the context in Indonesia and the organizations, that the local media outlets that YU represents and is working with. I was wondering what the context in Brazil is like. I mean, obviously, especially over the past kind of 4 years, there's been a discussion about the role of kind of quality journalism and the role of journalism in democracy, for example. What is the state there, and especially in terms of these questions about what is the role that big tech should play in trying to potentially fund some of this work?
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you to my fellow panelists and for Courtney's report, which is excellent. It's really great overview of everything that is happening. I think in Brazil, Congress was discussing legislation that it was called the fake news bill. And it would basically, I mean, on top of several other measures, it would organize something very similar to the Australian News Bargaining Code. But that the reaction of the platforms and of independent media in Brazil was very strong against it. Platforms had this huge lobbying effort against the bill. I mean, they were advertising in daily newspapers. They even had on the search pages, underneath the search box in Google, saying, do not vote for this bill because it's going to make us finance disinformation. And then independent media, I mean, there was this report that was published in Columbia Journalism Review saying that this was last year's report, I think, or in the beginning of the year, because now there's another report by Anya Schifrin. But that the first one saying, that independent media in Australia ended up not benefiting, and it was not good for everyone. And this was really, it became a mantra for independent media outlets in Brazil. So they were massively against the bill as well. And I guess a little bit influenced by big tech as well. So it ended up, we're in the middle of an election year, very complicated year. So there was basically a pause in the discussions, but I'm sure it's it's unavoidable. It's going to come back next year. The bill is still being discussed. And in the end, I mean, the bill has several problems. It's not an excellent bill. And the way our bargaining code is structured, it ends up benefiting more the big media conglomerates, the old school, the old media, right? But I think that the way it has been viewed, people just said, it was all bad, and they stopped all the discussion and say, this is not going to happen. There's no way, because, and also always this argument that we do not know how to define what's good journalism, what's not, what's quality information. So we're going to end up financing disinformation. These are always the two arguments they use to basically block any kind of discussion on payment for news content. So, but anyway, I think next year, regardless of who gets elected, this is a discussion that it's going to be back.
Great. Yeah, no, it's really interesting to hear those divisions in different types of news organizations in relation to this topic. I want to turn now to Prue because you know, the work that you do is in kind of different contexts from, you know, we heard from Indonesia and Brazil, kind of middle-sized markets, whereas the work you do is in kind of in oftentimes lower income markets. What are these policy discussions? What does that look like on the ground? And what do you anticipate kind of some of the implications of these policies being?
Can I echo, just to start off, everyone's thanks to CIMA for doing this report, and to Courtney, because, you know, for years, I think, you know, we've all been really frustrated that these conversations were happening in Europe, Australia, America, and we were just, you know, it's so catastrophic on the front lines in low income countries, and we just didn't see any discussion or help coming down the pipeline. But so I think it's really important to distinguish. It's really interesting to hear what's happening in middle income countries with big markets like Indonesia and Brazil, but it's a completely different discussion in low income countries where I have worked for 20 years and where New Narratives is focused. And I think the best way to set the context is to say, you know, a lot of these countries have only in the last 20 years developed capitalist democracies, which has been, you know, a boon. But at the same time, the media just didn't get a chance to get its legs under it and build an independent business model. It's going to be difficult because these are, you know, they have obviously poor citizens in a difficult market to monetize. As they were trying to build these media houses to really support these new democracies, at the same time, suddenly it was 2014, it was very clear that Facebook came in and Google came in and just, you know, hived off their audience completely and stopped them from developing digital advertising. They hadn't even got that far yet. So they really are in a bind now. I mean, it's impossible really to develop a digital advertising model. The audience has hived off to Facebook. Let's be frank, it's catastrophic. We hear a lot of stuff about what's going on in Myanmar and places where Facebook has been used to incite violence, but it's happening everywhere. Just because you don't hear about it, it's really undermining all the advances that many of the advances that happened in democracy in the last 20 years in these places. Disinformation machines. I mean, there was one in Liberia, a slickly produced video with a British presenter came out yesterday that all the media and the international community in Liberia felt compelled to actually comment on because it was completely fake. So, you know, it is really damaging. And I think for us, you know, what's been really frustrating is, you know, the conversations about policy changes. These are countries that are, you know, struggling to put in place a tax system, a rule of law. So the idea that they would actually be able to actually implement any of these laws or enforce them is not very practical. But at the same time, there are amazing opportunities that I think have come through digital technology. And, you know, we've been watching in awe, of course, all of us, what's happened at the New York Times and the Guardian, but also Malaysia Kini and Tempo and Rappler and other places that have developed, you know, had this revolution where they've developed these new business models based on audience revenue. And, you know, that same thing could work very well in low-income countries where they have big diasporas that are willing to pay their captive audiences. They can only get their content from these media houses, but the media houses just have never been exposed to any of this information about how they can develop these online digital plays. And I mean, we just held the first Hacks and Hackers in Liberia last month with some support from the Swedish embassy. And I mean, I laugh because we all heard about Hacks and Hackers 15 years ago, you know, but it had never happened in Liberia. And the media houses had no clue that they could raise money through social media. So it's really that low level. And just quickly to come back to this thing that why you focused on. And I think, and you know, I'm Australian originally, so I've had some visibility of what's happened there. I think policymakers and donors, we have to talk about donors in low-income countries, it's really important to focus on quality journalism. Media is not, improving media is one thing, but quality journalism is a different thing. And they have to be very cognizant of targeting that. I mean, that was the big knock one of the big knocks against the Australian code. It has had the effect of, the Guardian has hired 50 new reporters or something. So there has been great new journalism done with it, but it was not a requirement of the code. And so, as Patricia said, a lot of money went to News Corp properties and others who, media houses who derive the majority of their income through entertainment. And it's not been clear how much of that's gone to journalism. And it's the same thing with donors. So, USAID there's a lot of money supporting media in places like Africa, but it goes to community radio, which is not doing the hard shoe leather on the ground journalism that needs to be done in these countries. And it could be done if some of that money was spent in helping them revolutionize their business model.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Prue. I think there's kind of two large things that I've heard. One is about that you mentioned in your comments about institutions and how to deal with it. And that's one thing I want to send back to you, Courtney, because I know this is one of the things that you talked about a lot in your report. And the other is quality journalism. And, it's not just that money gets diverted from big tech, but part of the equation needs to be that it's going towards quality journalism. I know a couple of other people have probably something to say on that, but I want to pass it to you, Courtney, on both of those topics.
Yeah, thanks so much. So the infrastructure issue is the biggest one, right? It's a great idea to be like, hey, let's allow news organizations to license their content. But what does that mean? There's an entire back end that you need to have. You need to have an intellectual property law. You need to have copyright laws. It is really difficult to find information about that. I would have loved to have a map that has, which countries would even be positioned for that. You need to have collecting societies. You need to have trusted entities that are going to be the intermediary to track that, to distribute payments. You need to have the digital rights management system in place. There is a lot of infrastructure you need for that one thing. The underlying kind of challenge to all of these approaches, whether it's how to distribute taxation or who gets to benefit under collective bargaining or copyright rights, are what counts as news media, right? That is what counts as journalism is the fundamental question. Who benefits? And that has been I think the biggest sticking point, as you've heard, from the other excellent panelists in Australia. There was a lot of blowback about, local media, indigenous media, public service media that were not originally benefiting under the law, and that was heard around the world. I mean, policymakers in Canada, the US, Brazil, as you heard from Patricia, are trying to figure out, okay, how do we prevent that from happening? Or if it's not just about preventing it from going to big media, but how do you make sure that small media benefit? And I have to say that after doing this, I don't think it's such a bad idea that big media, big news media benefit. We need big entities that have the resources to do multi-year investigations, all the digital security, the safety issues, the administrative report, data report, whatever. You need some of those big ones, but it has to be, focused on supporting those smaller entities. I mean, there are tax breaks for all kinds of companies out there. Why not news media? And one of the things that's kind of in the background out there is this OECD proposal to impose a minimum corporate tax, which has nothing to do with journalism, but ultimately getting these companies to pay their fair share of taxes in the countries where they operate would at least provide an opportunity to potentially redistribute some of that. But I think the biggest challenge is deciding who benefits. And I mean, similarly with like the antitrust type of interventions, you need to have a competition authority. You need to have, an antitrust entity that can do meaningful investigations. One of the things that we're seeing, of course, is that these policies are getting adopted and implemented by global North, countries in the West, because they have the influence and the user base and the economic power to potentially influence. I mean, we wouldn't have expected to see Australia, but again, Australia, is a much more powerful market than a lot of lesser developing countries. Their policymakers are much more influential in, a lot of the tech debates. So I think that is one of the big issues here, is this go it alone. And I don't want to introduce this now, but just maybe we want to turn back to the idea is these policies are premised on social media platforms wanting to host news, which we're seeing shift with Facebook's pivot away from news. Although I do tend to agree with the Australian Competition Authority, which said that, there is an intrinsic value of news. And so it's not just about a dollar amount. And on the one hand, Facebook says it wants to pivot from news. On the other hand, it's kind of funding the international fact-checking network, and trying to clean up its platform. So let's be careful what we actually think they're doing. But more broadly, I think this shift away from cookies and not the yummy, delicious kind, but the kind that allow personalized and targeted advertising, I think that has the potential to have a more profound impact on the ability to pursue any of these policies. And we're at the very nascent stages of that. But that's going to pose, I do feel like by the time some of these countries get to the point of implementation, the advertising ecosystem could be organized very differently. And it's going to be another challenge to figure out how to benefit in that new environment.
That's a really interesting point. Thinking about, this is a fast moving environment, especially in the digital, ad ecosystem, especially now Apple's trying to move in as we move away from cookies potentially. It's really interesting to think about that. I want to turn to Patricia though, because this question of quality journalism is, I think, something that, and who is it and who produces it and how does the money get, go to those people, is I think something that you've been doing some reporting on in Brazil. And so I was wondering about, what have you seen in this case? We have, on the one hand, the position of the big tech companies, but also what's happening on the ground in terms of flows of money and who's getting it. Yeah.
That's an interesting question. Well, as we were discussing, there was some criticism against the Australian code saying, News Corp and other big media outlets that not necessarily focus on quality journalism have been the ones that that benefited more from the code. And so big tech, they argue that if there's tax and then there's a media fund, or if there's a bargaining code, who's going to decide what is quality journalism that deserves to be funded and what's not and who's not? And I mean, we don't, maybe Prue can talk a little bit more about this, but I think Australia has like an association that you need to be affiliated with, like a journalism. And in countries like Brazil, we don't have an association that says, okay, so you are a journalist. So they're trying to find criteria that if they have either a tax and a fund or the bargaining code, only quality journalism is going to benefit. And the big tech argues that they're going to end up money that they're financing independent media outlets. They won't have this money anymore because they will have to pay, it's going to go for tax or for the bargaining code, whatever. However, what I have been working on is the way that big tech is already financing low quality journalism, like the universe of junk news sites in Brazil. I mean, over 60% of them monetize with Google Ads. And these are news sites that pretend to be news sites, like legitimate, and they're basically spreading anti-vaccine, COVID, or electoral denialism content. And this is being enabled by Google Ads. And also one of the most successful extreme right-wing media outlets here in Brazil, let's say it's our equivalent to, I guess, Newsmax, is a huge success on YouTube. And it was part of the Google News initiative. And so it makes us think, so what is quality journalism? What kind of stuff are you going to finance? So either way, it's hard to say, okay, so the way it is now, it's also not working. It also ends up financing disinformation. So that's not an excuse not to change and not to try one of the alternatives that Courtney talks about in the report.
Can I just jump in to say too, I mean, one of the criticisms that I was very sympathetic to is that the funding from big tech to Australian media allowed them to keep on their old game, to not actually adapt and become more responsive to their audiences in the ways that the big thriving media businesses in the West have had to do. So that's an issue as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm curious why you also your thoughts on this, because I think that one of the challenges in a lot of these environments is, to do these type of bargaining agreements, well, you need to have both the media and the government kind of working hand in hand, right? The media
Right.
come with the issue that is at hand and how to potentially address it, and then government regulation is put in place to solve this. And thinking about the Brazilian context, where we have kind of a liberal president who often is the source of disinformation as the head of government. What does this mean when you have a relationship between kind of the media sector, the high quality media sector, and then maybe I could envision different scenarios where the government partner wouldn't share the same idea that we need to fund quality journalism. So how are you thinking about what does this mean in the long run for these types of proposals?
Yeah, we do face the same dilemma as the other panelists, Patricia and Brazil, all of the other concern on what will the relationship look like once we have the regulation, because then the independent news media will kind of owe this to the government, because then because of the policy in place, we were able to negotiate a better term with the big tech. Doesn't that make the relationship become imbalanced? How can we become more independent if the future and the sustainability of the media depends on this kind of policy? But to Courtney's point, I think what the complexity of the infrastructure is exactly what deter a lot of the stakeholders to even try to move forward with this issue, because sometimes it's just too complex. But then the thing that the way we do it in Indonesia is we try to be as inclusive as possible from the beginning. So we invite all associations to create this task force of media sustainability, and week after week, we just try to gather as much input as possible, so that all this concern can be discussed, and then find a middle ground that can really put all interests in the common standing. And what we come up is something that is not satisfying for everyone, but at least we need to start somewhere. Because the lack of data that also mentioned in the report is exactly what we face, but we cannot have the data if we don't have the regulation in place. So it's kind of a chicken and egg situation. Without the law, without the regulation, then we'll have no access to get the data. But without the data, we will not have a transparent transparent discussion on what is the right amount of value for the content. So our approach now is just move forward as inclusive as possible. Try to not benefit only one, only the big media, but also the small local media.
Can I just note something on the data side? Because yes, it's true, we don't have data. I think there's a huge missed opportunity in all of the legislation I'm seeing in terms of gaining access to that data. Talking to one of the Senate offices about the Journalist Conservation Preservation Act here, they did manage to, add something about news media organizations reporting on how much they get. We need to have the media organizations and policymakers doing what we can without that data from the companies while we're trying to get it. But there's no reason that media organizations can't do a better job in the meantime of collecting data on their end, and ideally putting that into conversation with a broader set of data from the media outlets, because it's easy for us to blame big tech, but there is also more that the media industry should be doing, and that includes doing more to collect and aggregate and create that data so that we can show good faith of what the media industry can do. And that way, when eventually we do get access, because I think there are going to be some movements towards at least independent researcher access to data through some sort of accreditation process, then we have something to put that data from the platforms into conversation with. But it's really easy to just constantly blame them. So I think we need to work on figuring out how we can learn from what we know. And, I know you guys are doing that, and some other outlets are trying to collect that. There's this nascent effort to think about how we could have like a data commons for media, but I think we need to practice what we preach with respect to transparency and data collection.
Great. Thank you, Courtney. I see we have a lot of really good questions in our queue. So I'm now going to ask my colleague, Andrea at CIMA. She's going to help us sort through. So I think we're going to try and take 3 questions at a time, and then we'll kind of, Andrea will give us the questions, then we'll kind of sort them out amongst our panelists. Andrea?
Yeah, so our first question comes from Jan Lublinsky at DW Academy. He directs the question to Courtney. I understand that we need long-term work on both sides, advocacy for legal change and also consultancy for media outlets and also the advertising market. Do we also need a mechanism in each country to assess the quality of journalism in the given context and thus identify and encourage good media? Second question comes from Ricardo Trotti for Patricia. Do you think Google's showcase program is good for a Brazilian press? Do you think it is enough, or the media considers it enough to neutralize legislation that forces big tech companies to pay for news content? And our third question for this round comes from William Bird. I'd love to hear the panelists' view on if there is tech agnostic and vaguely future professional model for contribution to journalism to help avoid the tech moving faster than the policy. For example, could it be done on a revenue and population base?
Great.
Okay, so I'll just jump in for Jan's question and then the third question. I mean, I think an overarching question in response to the last question is, what is the role of journalism? What are we really trying to support? It's an informed citizenry, public health, et cetera. So we need to think about the objectives of journalism rather than this idea of like quality journalism. Also, I'm doing this big research project for Internews that's funded by the State Department. And what I'm finding is a lot of journalism outlets are doing things that aren't really journalism. It's not content production, it's events, it's consulting, it's content production for other things, it's fact checking, it's, lots of different things. So I think we need to get specific. And when we talk about quality journalism, what we're actually talking about, and think about the impact of types of information on the ecosystem that you want to create in a country. I think that I'm not sure we need a mechanism by country to determine quality media, but I think that is something that has to be grappled with, is whether this is about supporting the news industry or whether these interventions are about supporting quality journalism. And they're different, right? We have terrible news organizations in this country. And I think and I'm in the United States right now, part of that is that we equate punditry with journalism. So I do think that it would behoove our community to really double down on like, what is journalism versus other forms of communication, other forms of, expressing yourself, all of which should be protected. No one should be jailed or killed for their expression. But if we're talking about how to support the news industry, it is different than just quality journalism. And so I think we need to think about those things a little bit differently and separately, so we don't get so caught up in the quality issue when we're talking about an industry issue. So on the quality thing, I think, and kind of thinking about who benefits could have to do with quality journalism. But I really like the idea of using independent professional self-regulatory approaches, whether those are things like the Journalism Trust Initiative or Ads for News or the local professional associations. Like in the United States, the Senate Press Gallery is run by the Senate Press Corps, and they decide who gets in and who gets out. So it's the profession deciding. That is my preference for how we would decide these things. In Canada, you know, they have already a way for citizens to allocate some tax incentives to individual media outlets. And there's a process there that's very open, very transparent. They have a list of all the news organizations, you know, very clear criteria. Definitely there's always criticism with any policy, but like that took me, I don't know, 15 minutes to find out all about that. Whereas like in the US right now, we have zero thoughts about how to make this Journalist Preservation Act transparent. At least let's make an agency responsible for showing that information. And I think that when we get to this idea of like good media or who benefits, so much of this is going to be about trust in the process and about transparency. But I think this is, and that's essentially a tech agnostic approach. So, I mean, to the last question, I think focusing on core values like explainability about who gets to benefit, about transparency, about being able to track the money, all of those sort of things are not dependent on the tech. It's really dependent upon the legislative and regulatory framework that we put in place.
Great, thanks.
Can I just jump in, because I wanted to ask you, Courtney, I mean, the US does have a tax incentive structure in place for non-profit media. And my understanding is that non-profit media, which is a tax deduction for people to make a donation, so National Public Radio and these hundreds of non-profit newsrooms that have sprung up across the country now, that they get far more money in donations than a conservative, you know, an extreme right-wing media outlet might get.
So I think that's a little bit different because in the US, it's about nonprofit, period. It's not the fact that they are a media organization. There is a tax framework to provide benefits to nonprofit media. I have not seen any reporting on whether they get more or less than right-wing media, but I will say that InfoWars was a multi-million-dollar business and it claimed to be right-wing, or it claimed to be journalistic. Obviously, we know it's not. But so I'm not really sure about that.
But it's making money through advertising, whereas I mean I'm really taken by this idea that if you have to get the money from the audience, then you have to be responsible. You have to build trust with the audience, and I think so. I think that's a good. I mean, the non-profit structure for news in America now is, I think, you know, a real shining light in what's happening with quality journalism around the world.
I want to offer Patricia the opportunity to respond to Ricardo's question about, I think, Google Showcase, and also if you could tell us what Google Showcase is. But I also want to add one more component to this and open it up to YU and Peru as well, because I think we're talking about policy interventions that would, you know, require big tech to fund things in different mechanisms. But there's also the philanthropic work that these big tech, we know some of the research we've done on support to digital outlets that Facebook and Google are giving smaller, you know, medium-sized donations, or during the pandemic, there were kind of grant-making programs. So that's a part of it as well. And I don't know what people's feelings are in regards to kind of that type of support that isn't regulatory, isn't systematic, but exists. So Patricia?
Sure. I think Google News Showcase, and maybe I'm not sure if the person who asked is with Google, so the person might be better equipped to explain this, but it's a partnership and several media outlets in Brazil have signed on to it, and they're getting funding and for Google to use their content as in quality journalism content. And of course, I think it's very good. You know, it's funding for quality journalism. But I think there's two things that make it not enough and does not solve the problem. One is, how sustainable is that? I mean, it's media outlets are still at the mercy of, you know, big tech. As Courtney was saying, the video thing, the video on Facebook, or if Facebook now is just decided not to give so much focus to news, that leaves again the media outlets very vulnerable to their decisions. It's just there's no transparency and there's no commitment as to they're going to keep on doing this. I mean, you can't have, it's not a sustainable source of revenues. Whereas if you have regulation, you could at least have something with more predictability. But having said that, of course, it's good. And thank God they are investing in quality journalism.
Great, thank you. While you Prue, any reaction as well to those types of initiatives? Maybe not
Sure.
We'll showcase, but something similar.
Yeah, we do have a lot of initiative similar to the one that you mentioned during the pandemic. The big tech, Google and Meta, gave fellowships and grants for small independent news media, and also and that I think helped hundreds of local media in Indonesia to survive during the pandemic when advertising revenue was declining. But as Patricia said, it's temporary measure. Google Showcase or Google News Initiative or any other grants from the big tech is about, it's a smaller intervention, but we need to tackle the bigger issue, the ecosystem, because the ecosystem currently is not sustainable for news media. What constitutes news media and what is quality journalism is another debate that needs to take place. But we have to agree that at this moment, the current ecosystem is not giving incentive for good quality journalism. There's not enough support, as all the other panelists have mentioned, how Google AdSense basically supporting disinformation and misinformation through all of the other smaller websites. So we need this policy, we need this regulation in order to create a better ecosystem for the media.
Yeah, can I just add that I've seen Google do really amazing things in Australia and to a lesser extent in Asia. Just training media houses on using Google Analytics so they can understand their audiences better, and to make the most of other news products, to do better journalism, but also to build these products to monetize their audiences. So helping them understand and do a better job of serving their audiences has been really game-changing, but it's almost non-existent in Africa and the Pacific. And I understand that it's a business decision. There's they don't see a lot of opportunity for monetization in poor countries, but it's a real missed opportunity, I think. And again, we're letting the market or the big tech decide where they should have these interventions. And I think it would be nice if they could be compelled to have those same interventions in countries where the money is not necessarily so, it's not so lucrative. But look, just one small thing that I've always wondered, one thing that the media houses in low income countries have done, if they've got a website, they've got Google AdSense. And I am not a technologist and I haven't thought through the economics of this, but I don't know why they can't at least just increase the rates of Google AdSense in certain settings, certainly low income countries. That would go a long way to helping balance the damage that they're doing, and especially Facebook just completely unresponsive to the problems that they cause media in these countries. When someone's Facebook account gets hacked and Facebook just is just not responsive for months on end, it can drive a media house out of business. So that's one thing I could see them doing.
Great, thank you, Prue. And Andrea, let's go ahead and take 3 more questions.
So the next question comes from Simran Agarwal. Could the panelists talk about what are the limits that come from receiving funding from the platforms? Is there some information from on the ground conditions, not just for eligibility, but for what kind of content and funding in which form? This was already alluded to, sort of. The next question from Jeff Lovett. Talking about business models and to support for strengthening media outlets capacity. Often the challenge is distribution of content through different channels and protection from government restrictions, either through cutting off access to government advertising or legal challenges, cases against independent media. Can donors focus more on those challenges, or is that more the role of the media outlets themselves in organizing to take on such challenges? And our last question comes from Marija Sakyas from the perspective of Serbian media. Serbian media is saturated with fake news outlets, including ones supported and promoted by the government. Quality journalism outlets are few and with limited visibility. What is the solution for cases like these, given the dominance of false and captured media?
Great. Thank you. Yeah, so there's some really interesting questions here. I think the first one is kind of about grant funding and what kind of stipulations come along with that. And people can chime in on that if they want. I think the one that I found to be really interesting as well is that second one is about the component of donors in there, and what can, we're talking about a lot of the countries we're talking about are developing countries, and what can a donor organization do in this space? So that's one that I'll throw to you all. And then also this issue of the fake news. I think we've kind of dealt with it a little bit of, but what do you do in those kind of situations if you are a quality journalist in a place like Serbia and you have a mechanism that is actually the money's going to fake news? So yeah, are there any responses to these questions, Courtney?
Yeah, so I think with respect to kind of all of the questions are around this issue that has to do with capture. So, in Serbia, we're talking about media capture with fake news outlets, the role of government, but there's also, I think, this emerging idea of infrastructure capture by the platforms. And so, like, on the one hand, what Prue is saying, like, it would be great to get these small media outlets on Google, get them some more, get them higher AdSense. And it's great, as why you pointed out, there are all these trainings on how to use Facebook and Google, and they have all these initiatives. On the other hand, this is essentially creating even more dependency on the platforms, integrating the platforms even more into journalism. So I think we need to really think about that if that's the direction we're heading. And similarly, news organizations, not most small, like news organizations that are doing the type of journalism I think that we would think of as quality journalism, are not necessarily building big audiences. And so this issue of like advertising revenue from platforms is premised on audience size and reach and those sort of things. But a lot of media are serving niche audiences, or they're serving a smaller population. So that's not ever going to result in anything. The issue around kind of the broader structure of capture, for example, government advertising, that's actually a lot more fundamental to the business models in a lot of lesser developed countries and economically less developed countries, where government advertising is a huge driver for these news outlets. And that is absolutely subject in many places to manipulation. Donors should absolutely focus more on that. And they should also use their donor funding to, for example, advertise in those media, like, USAID, the UN, all of these big organizations that have all these other programs that have nothing to do with media could actually proactively support media by using those advertising dollars, kind of public awareness dollars, to support quality media. That's one thing that donors could do that would be very easy, quick, doesn't require new legislation, that sort of thing. But there is, to go back to the platforms, very little transparency. I will say, Google, I'm in the process of trying to kind of figure out where all of this money goes and to who and how that's decided. That information is scattered across a million different Google blog posts and Facebook news posts and all of these different things. So even just, trying to get those companies, which they have definitely heard from me and others on this call, about making that information available. Again, this issue of not just the provision of information, but making it accessible and transparent and easily identifiable, I think would be really important, because I am concerned about how platforms are using support to media. I'm going to say outside of the COVID relief, but through partnerships and the initiative in countries. It does, my initial research, it shows that they're focused on countries where regulation is being threatened or put in place. Not surprising. And, that's something that we need to be more cognizant of. And I think really in the media development community, ask ourselves, if we're going to focus on the kind of capacity building to take better use of platforms in this advertising system, then we need to put in place a structure that's going to protect the media in that environment. Otherwise, we need to figure out how to help them be sustainable outside of any given platform.
Great, thank you. Patricia, I see you have your hand raised.
Yes, sorry, I just wanted to add something to what Courtney was saying. In terms of capture, I think, of course, government advertising is a huge issue and it's fundamental, but there's also there are some changes in the way the pro-government news outlets, and many of them junk news outlets, which I think it's something very common in Bosnia, in Serbia, like our colleague was telling us, in I'm not sure Indonesia, but the Philippines and in Brazil. Instead of directly funneling government advertising, there are other ways of increasing these websites' traffic in terms of sharing and promoting the websites and supplying with original content that is pro-government. And this in turn increases the traffic of the websites and the monetization. So, I mean, government advertising is, of course, very important, but there are other ways to sort of support and promote this lower quality journalism sites.
In Indonesia, if I may add, the requirement for news media outlets to receive grants or funding, I think it's mostly based on how they perform and how their content are relevant to their audience. So I think just to make the situation is more clear, I think every stakeholder in this ecosystem has to play a role, and all the initiative that already in place, as long as it's supporting good quality journalism, is part of this bigger initiative. So we don't necessarily have to compare one or the other, but as long as it's directed to the same goal, I think it's positive for the news media ecosystem.
Yeah, can I just to be very clear that the fundamental problem to journalism in low-income countries is the business model. The journalists, people put their head in the sand about this, but the journalists are not paid to do independent journalism. They make they make almost no money from their bosses, and they make most of their money from the aid organizations that they get per diems from, the rewritten press releases, and the handouts from politicians who are paying them to write propaganda. And so it's finding ways to have them build sustainable businesses not dependent on government advertising and handouts, an illegitimate market. So I mean, this is why I keep going back to the most promising opportunity I can see is, just to give you some numbers, a media house in a low-income country, and a quality news organization that will set the agenda for those countries. So if you have a great media house that may have not that many readers, but it does great journalism, then every radio station in the country will talk about what's on the front page of that newspaper every day. Those media houses might operate on as little as $50,000 a year. They're still doing fantastic journalism. So you imagine if you can get 2,000 people in their diaspora to pay $25 a year, you've doubled their income immediately, right? So there are sort of low hanging fruit opportunities like that, that if donor support, including from the big tech, was going to help them reach that low hanging fruit, could be really game changing.
Got it. Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I think this has kind of come up in a couple different interventions around the business model is ultimately the challenge that news organizations are facing globally. And these policy interventions are meant to be around big tech, in particular, create at least one revenue stream, not necessarily the panacea, but when in concert with a couple other things, whether it's philanthropic support, subscriber support, could potentially create a way that we have a more sustainable and viable media ecosystem that's going to support the independent journalism, not just the big kind of media, because a lot of organizations have a lot of different components they're working on. So I think it's really important. And I think also to think about, what is the role of donors in this space as well? Because obviously governments and tech sector are big, but we do have other mechanisms that we can leverage. And I think, Courtney made that a really good point about that. Unfortunately, we've actually come to kind of the end of our time today for this chat. It's been a really good one. I want to leave each of you with just a 2-minute kind of what is the final kind of takeaway. And I'm gonna start with Patricia. What is the big takeaway for what you would this kind of debate going forward, and what we'd be needing to paying attention to?
Well, I think the takeaway, and that's in the report, I mean, so many countries are trying to find ways to have quality journalism, to make quality journalism sustainable. And there's no consensus as to what's the best way. Is it taxation? Is it copyright? Is it the bargaining code? But one thing I think it becomes really clear is that there needs to be some sort of regulation. As it is now, it's just not transparent, and it's only the decision of the big internet platforms of who's going to get funded or not. And then this would be good. And I'm not sure which model is the best. We're all trying to understand that. But I think there's a need for regulation.
Great. Thank you. Why you?
Yeah, I think we all agree that good quality journalism is in the best interest of everyone, including the platforms, especially publishers, but also the general public. And we also need to, work inclusively. We need to take into account different perspective, especially from the smaller local independent news media, so that any kind of solution to get there is transparent enough and will provide an opening to create a sustainable news media.
Great, thank you. Prue?
I think I just end with a plea that so much money is actually being spent on media development in low-income countries, and it is not going to this issue of the business model. And there is so much opportunity that I see in digital platforms. I wish that more, just even a small percentage of the donor money that usually goes to training and community radio was actually devoted to this problem of the business model for the quality media that sets the standard and sets the news agenda in these countries. I think there's a lot of bang for buck in that. And just to echo what Courtney said, and I've been banging on this for a long time, that donors in developing countries, it's madness that they do not advertise in the local media. They've worked so hard to build democracies and human rights and a rule of law in these countries. To not be also seeing the media as an important part of that is madness.
Great. And finally, Courtney, thank you again for your report. It's really kickstarted, I think, what has been a really great discussion today. So what are your final thoughts for us?
I think my final thoughts would be, please, media organizations, collect data, especially as if you're working in a country where there is this new legislation. We're not going to be able to understand how this actually impacts, or benefits news media unless we have that sort of information. And I think to regulators, you know, even if you're only focused on like news media bargaining, try to build in data access requirements and transparency requirements that will make it easier for all of us to understand what is happening behind the scenes so we can make evidence-based policy interventions. And then I think with respect to kind of smaller countries and lower income countries, I mean, there is a lot of low-hanging fruit, and we need to be more sophisticated, because I think that a lot of these strategies, you know, are not going to be viable there. And so it's either going to require a global approach, or for some more, maybe like collective bargaining among groups of countries, which, having worked at, you know, the UN, I think is going to be really challenging. But, you know, we need to, I think, get the companies to be more honest and more transparent. And that is not going to happen out of the goodwill of their founders or, you know, their shareholders. And so we're going to have to mandate that through regulation and legislation. But I'd far prefer to focus on regulating the fundamental business practices that impact this environment, rather than anything to do with their support to journalism or anything like that. I think that the more we can focus on the structural and infrastructure environment, the less we focus on anything to do with content or viewpoint or even quality, because it's so susceptible to political capture, I think the better.
Great, thank you. Patricia, Wayu, Prue, Courtney, thank you for just a really excellent conversation. I know I've learned a lot, and it's been a real honor to moderate this today. So thank you so much for your time. And on behalf of all the people who are joining us, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.